She's nothing. The words didn't just land, they echoed, sharp and clean, cutting through the low hum of laughter and clinking glasses like a crack in polished glass, and for a moment, the entire ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria seemed to pause, even if no one dared to show it, because when Sebastian Wolf spoke, people listened, even when they pretended not to, even when what he said made the air feel heavier than it should have been. Emily Hayes stood exactly where he had left her, 3 feet to his right, just outside the golden circle of attention, her fingers tightening around the small ivory envelope in her hand, the edges already softened from how many times she had opened it tonight, her breath shallow, her chest rising just a little too fast beneath a simple navy dress that suddenly felt far too thin for a room this cold, this bright, this unforgiving. The chandeliers above shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars, reflecting off champagne flutes and diamond necklaces, off tailored tuxedos and silk gowns that whispered wealth in every movement, but none of that reached her, none of that softened the way his voice still rang in her ears, steady, indifferent, final, as if he had just dismissed a line item in a quarterly report instead of a human being standing within arm's reach. She had known Sebastian could be cold, everyone knew that, but knowing it and standing inside it were 2 very different things, and tonight, she felt it fully for the first time, not as a rumor, not as a reputation, but as something real, something that pressed against her ribs and made it hard to breathe. Across the room, someone laughed too loudly, a string quartet played something soft and elegant, and the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows stretched endlessly into the Manhattan night. But Emily's world had narrowed to the weight in her hand, to the thin piece of paper inside that envelope, to the image she hadn't meant to bring but couldn't leave behind, because part of her had hoped, stupidly, maybe, that tonight would be different, that he would look at her and see something more than a mistake he wanted erased. Her thumb traced the edge of the envelope, a small, unconscious motion, grounding herself as her mind replayed his words again, quieter now but somehow worse, because they sounded so certain, so practiced, as if he had already decided who she was long before she ever stepped into this room. She swallowed, forcing herself to stay upright, to not let the tremor in her hands reach her shoulders, because the last thing she would give him was the satisfaction of watching her break in front of an audience that already didn't see her, already didn't care. Somewhere behind her, a waiter passed with a tray of champagne, the scent of citrus and something floral drifting through the air, but it only made her stomach tighten, a faint wave of nausea rising that she tried to ignore, pressing her lips together as she shifted her weight slightly, one hand instinctively brushing against her lower abdomen for just a second before pulling back, as if the gesture itself might reveal too much. No one noticed. No one ever did. And yet, inside that envelope, inside that fragile black and white image, was a truth that didn't care about chandeliers or reputations or the carefully constructed distance Sebastian Wolf kept between himself and anything that felt real. Emily closed her eyes for half a second, just enough to steady herself, just enough to keep the tears from forming, and when she opened them again, her gaze lifted, not to the crowd, not to the glittering room, but to him, standing at the center of it all, composed, untouchable, already moving on as if she had never been there at all, and something quiet shifted inside her then, not loud, not dramatic, just a small, firm realization that settled deep in her chest. He might believe she was nothing, but he had no idea what she was holding in her hands, or what it was about to change. Emily did not remember walking out of the ballroom, only the sudden shift from warmth to the cool hush of the marble hallway, the music fading behind her like something distant and unreal, her heels echoing softly with each step as if the building itself was reminding her she was still here, still moving, still holding on to something that refused to disappear no matter how much he had tried to reduce it to nothing. And when the restroom door closed behind her, the silence wrapped around her completely, heavy and immediate, broken only by the faint hum of overhead lights and the quiet rush of her own breathing as she leaned both hands against the cold marble counter, her head dipping for a second as if the weight of the night had finally found somewhere to land. She swallowed hard, blinking at her reflection in the mirror, and for a moment she did not recognize the woman staring back at her, because the girl who had walked into that ballroom had still believed in something fragile and hopeful, something that now felt almost naive, and yet beneath the shock, beneath the sting of humiliation, there was something else beginning to surface, something steadier, something that did not depend on whether Sebastian Wolf chose to see her or not. Her fingers tightened around the envelope again, and this time, she did not hesitate. Slowly, carefully, she opened it, sliding the thin photograph into her palm, her eyes tracing the soft, grainy outline she had already memorized, the tiny shape that seemed impossibly small and yet carried a weight that dwarfed everything else in her life, everything else in this city, everything else in that ballroom filled with people who measured worth in numbers and appearances. Her breath caught, just for a second, as her thumb brushed lightly over the image, and her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, meant for no one but the quiet truth she was finally allowing herself to face. "You are not nothing," she said, her lips trembling just slightly before steadying. "You are everything I have left." The words lingered in the air, soft but certain, and for the first time since his voice had cut through the room, something inside her stopped shaking. She straightened slowly, her shoulders pulling back, her gaze lifting again to meet her reflection, and there was a difference now, subtle but undeniable, because the girl who had stood beside him waiting to be acknowledged was gone, replaced by someone who understood that she could not wait for permission to exist. A sudden wave of dizziness brushed over her, brief but sharp. Enough to make her grip the counter again, her free hand instinctively pressing lightly against her lower abdomen as she closed her eyes for a moment, breathing through it, reminding herself to stay steady, to stay grounded, because whatever came next, she was not alone, not really, not anymore. When she opened her eyes again, her reflection looked back at her with something new in it, something that had not been there before tonight, and it was not anger, not exactly, but something quieter and stronger, something that said she would not disappear just because someone powerful had decided she should. Outside, the muffled sound of applause drifted faintly through the walls, another speech, another moment of celebration that had nothing to do with her, but for the first time, she did not feel small in comparison to it, because the truth in her hand mattered more than any headline, any deal, any carefully crafted image Sebastian Wolf had built around himself. She slid the ultrasound back into the envelope, holding it close for a second before tucking it safely into her purse, her movements deliberate now, controlled, as if each small action was part of a decision she was making piece by piece. He had already chosen what she was to him, already spoken it out loud for the world to hear, and maybe he would never take it back, maybe he would never understand what he had dismissed so easily, but that did not change what was real, and it did not change what she was going to protect. Emily took one last look at herself, then turned toward the door, her hand pausing on the handle for just a fraction of a second before she pushed it open and stepped back into the corridor, the noise of the gala slowly rising again, but this time, she was not walking back to him, she was walking forward without him, carrying something far more important than anything he could offer, even if he had not realized it yet. Emily had almost reached the exit when the dizziness returned, stronger this time, a sudden wave that blurred the edges of the hallway and made the polished marble floor feel unsteady beneath her heels, and she slowed instinctively, one hand brushing against the wall as she tried to steady her breathing, telling herself it was just exhaustion, just the weight of the night catching up to her, but her body was no longer listening to quiet reassurances, not when it had already been pushed too far, not when everything inside her was asking her to stop, to rest, to acknowledge what she had been trying to carry alone. A couple passed by her without slowing, their laughter soft and distant, and for a second she wondered if she looked as invisible as she felt, just another figure in a hallway that led back to a world she no longer belonged to, and then the sound hit her, sharp and sudden, the ballroom doors opening behind her as applause swelled again, louder this time, followed by his voice, calm and composed, continuing a conversation that had already moved past her existence entirely. She did not turn around. She could not. Instead, she took another step forward, then another, each one slower than the last, her vision narrowing as a faint ringing filled her ears, her fingers tightening instinctively around the strap of her purse as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the moment. The overhead light seemed too bright now, the air too thin, and she tried to inhale deeply, but it felt incomplete, like her lungs could not quite catch up, and then the world tilted, just slightly at first, then enough that she had to stop completely, her hand pressing flat against her abdomen again without thinking, a quiet protective gesture that came from somewhere deeper than fear. "Not here," she whispered under her breath, barely audible even to herself, "not now." But her body had already decided. The next step never came. Instead, her knees weakened, the strength leaving her legs in a slow, undeniable release, and she reached out for the wall again, but her grip slipped, her balance gone before she could correct it, and the hallway, the lights, the distant music all seemed to fold inward at once. The last thing she felt was the cold floor beneath her as everything went dark. The shift was immediate. Voices replaced silence. Shoes against marble, hurried, concerned, no longer ignoring her but circling now, breaking through the invisibility that had wrapped around her just moments before. Someone called for help, another voice sharper, more urgent, and within seconds the quiet hallway transformed into something else entirely, something focused, something real. Back inside the ballroom, Sebastian paused mid-sentence, just for a fraction of a second, the subtle disturbance near the entrance catching his attention even as he tried to continue, tried to maintain the control he never lost in public, but something about the movement, the sudden break in rhythm, pulled his gaze toward the doors before he could stop himself. He saw the cluster forming in the hallway, the staff moving quickly, and for reasons he could not immediately explain, his chest tightened, a brief, unfamiliar pressure that did not belong in a room where he controlled every outcome. It meant nothing, he told himself. It had nothing to do with him. And yet, his words faltered, just slightly, just enough that the room noticed the pause even if they did not understand it, and before he could decide whether to ignore it or address it, one of the event coordinators leaned toward him, her voice low but urgent as she whispered something that shifted everything in an instant. A woman collapsed. She is being taken to the medical room. Sebastian's jaw tightened, his expression barely changing, but his eyes flickered once, sharp and focused, and though he did not say her name, though he had already decided what she was to him, the image of her standing beside him only minutes ago, quiet and steady, flashed through his mind with a clarity he could not dismiss. For the first time that night, control slipped, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to see, but enough that he felt it, a small crack forming in something he had always kept sealed, and before he could fully understand why, he found himself turning toward the doors, his speech forgotten, his attention no longer on the room, but on the one person he had just convinced himself did not matter at all. The medical room was smaller than expected, tucked behind the grand hallway as if it had been designed for minor inconveniences rather than moments that could shift the course of someone's life, and yet now it felt like the center of everything as Emily lay still on the narrow examination bed, her breathing shallow but steady, a faint crease between her brows as if even unconscious she was still holding onto something, still refusing to let go completely. A nurse moved quickly beside her, adjusting the small monitor that now tracked her pulse, while another voice called out for water, for space, for quiet, and the controlled urgency in the room carried a different kind of authority than the ballroom outside, one that did not care about wealth or reputation, only about what was real and immediate. The door opened again, sharper this time, and Sebastian stepped inside without waiting to be invited, his presence cutting through the movement in the room with the same certainty it always did, but something about him was different now, something less composed, less detached, even if only by a fraction. His gaze went straight to her, bypassing everyone else, landing on the still figure on the bed with a focus that felt almost too intense, as if he were trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had already decided to believe. She looked smaller here, he realized, not insignificant, not invisible, but fragile in a way that did not belong to the version of her he had dismissed so easily just minutes ago, and that realization settled somewhere uncomfortable in his chest, something he could not immediately categorize or control. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but firm, directed at no one in particular and yet demanding an answer all the same. "She collapsed in the hallway," one of the staff replied, her tone respectful but not deferential, her attention still primarily on Emily as she checked her vitals again. "She is conscious intermittently, but her blood pressure dropped quickly." Sebastian's jaw tightened, the information processing quickly, efficiently, the way he handled every situation, and yet there was a delay, a hesitation that did not belong in his usual precision, because this was not a business problem, not something he could reduce to numbers and outcomes. A doctor entered moments later, his expression focused, his movements practiced, and he stepped to the bedside without acknowledging Sebastian at first, placing a hand lightly near Emily's shoulder as he spoke to the nurse in a quiet, professional tone. "We need to monitor her closely," he said, then paused, his eyes shifting briefly to the chart being prepared, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that changed the air in the room. "Stress like this is not safe for her condition." Sebastian's eyes narrowed slightly, the word condition catching his attention immediately, pulling him forward half a step before he could stop himself. "What condition?" he asked, more sharply now, the edge in his voice unmistakable. The doctor finally looked at him directly, measuring him in a quick glance, then answering with the same calm clarity he would offer anyone, regardless of status. "She is pregnant," he said, and the words did not echo the way they might have in a larger space, but they did not need to, because they landed with a force that was immediate and undeniable, cutting through every assumption Sebastian had made, every decision he had already justified. For a second, nothing moved. The room, the people, even the quiet hum of the equipment seemed to fade into the background as his mind caught on that single fact, repeating it, testing it, refusing it, and then confronting it again. Pregnant. His gaze shifted back to Emily, to the slight rise and fall of her breathing, to the hand resting loosely at her side, and suddenly, uninvited and unavoidable, another image surfaced in his mind, one he had not noticed before, the way her hand had hovered protectively over her abdomen in the hallway, the way she had held that envelope as if it mattered more than anything else in the room. Something cold and sharp moved through him then, not anger, not exactly, but something closer to realization, to the first crack in a certainty he had carried without question, and for the first time that night, for the first time in a long time, Sebastian Wolf did not have an immediate answer for what came next. The word did not fade. It stayed, lodged somewhere deep in Sebastian's mind as if it refused to be processed the way everything else in his world usually was. Clean, structured, predictable, and instead it lingered, expanding into something heavier with every passing second as he stood there, looking at Emily in a way he had not allowed himself to before, not really seeing her until now, not beyond the surface he had already judged and dismissed. Pregnant. The realization unfolded slowly, piece by piece, connecting details he had ignored, moments he had brushed aside, the subtle way she had carried herself tonight, the quiet tension in her posture, the protective instinct in that single unconscious gesture he had not understood at the time, and suddenly it all aligned into something undeniable, something that did not ask for his approval or his interpretation, only his acknowledgement. "That is not possible," he said finally, the words quieter than expected, less certain than anything he had said all evening, and for once, they sounded less like a statement and more like something he was trying to convince himself of. The doctor did not react to the tone, did not adjust his explanation to accommodate doubt or status, he simply met Sebastian's gaze with calm professionalism. "It is not a question of possibility," he replied, "it is a fact, and right now the priority is her stability and the safety of the pregnancy." The simplicity of that response left no space for negotiation, no angle for control, and Sebastian felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest again, sharper this time, as his eyes returned to Emily, to the rise and fall of her breathing that suddenly felt like the only thing anchoring the room to reality. His mind moved quickly, retracing timelines, calculating, searching for certainty the only way he knew how, but the answer he kept arriving at did not change, no matter how many times he approached it from a different angle. She had not told him. Or maybe she had tried, and he had not listened. The memory hit him without warning, clear and precise, her standing beside him earlier, quiet but present, holding that envelope with a kind of careful urgency he had dismissed as irrelevant, and then his own voice, cold and final, cutting through the space between them as if nothing she carried could possibly matter. "She is nothing." The words came back now, not as power, not as control, but as something heavier, something that settled against the new reality in a way that made them feel suddenly reckless, dangerously incomplete. Why did she not say anything, he asked, though the question felt hollow even as it left his mouth, because somewhere beneath it, he already understood the answer he did not want to face. The nurse glanced at him briefly before returning her focus to Emily. "Stress affects people differently," she said simply, "and some do not feel safe speaking when they believe they will not be heard." The implication was quiet but unmistakable, and it landed harder than any accusation could have, because it did not challenge him directly, it simply revealed something he had already shown. Sebastian exhaled slowly, his composure still intact on the surface, but beneath it something was shifting, something that did not fit into the controlled structure he had built his life around, because this was not a situation he could resolve with a decision or a transaction, this was something that required him to reconsider something far more fundamental. His gaze dropped briefly to her hand, resting loosely near the edge of the bed, and without thinking, he stepped closer, just enough that the distance between them no longer felt deliberate, no longer felt like something he was maintaining out of choice. She had carried this alone, he realized, not as an abstract concept, but as a reality that had existed beside him while he chose not to see it, while he reduced her to something insignificant, something disposable, and the weight of that realization did not come all at once, but it was there, building, undeniable, waiting for him to decide whether he would continue to ignore it or finally face what it meant. Time did not move the way it usually did for Sebastian after that moment. It stretched instead, every second carrying more weight than the last as he stood beside the narrow hospital bed, his gaze fixed on Emily as if looking away might somehow undo what he had just learned, or worse, confirm that it was real in a way he could not control. The room had settled into a quieter rhythm now, the urgency fading into steady monitoring, soft voices, controlled movement, but inside him nothing felt steady, nothing felt controlled, and that was something he had not experienced in years. He had built his life on certainty, on decisions made quickly and executed without hesitation, but this was different. This demanded something he had never needed before, something he had never practiced, and he could feel that absence now, like a gap he did not know how to fill. The doctor spoke again, outlining what they would do next: routine observations, hydration, rest, careful monitoring for the next few hours, but Sebastian barely processed the details, because his attention kept returning to the same point, the same quiet, undeniable truth lying right in front of him, breathing softly, unaware of the shift she had caused in him simply by existing in a way he could no longer deny. He took another step closer without realizing it, his hand hovering for a brief second near the edge of the bed before lowering again, not touching her, not yet, as if even that required a permission he was not sure he deserved. His mind replayed everything again, faster now, sharper, searching for the exact moment things had gone wrong, the point where he could have seen this, understood this, stopped himself from saying what he had said, but the more he searched, the clearer it became that there had not been a single moment, it had been a pattern, a series of choices, each one reinforcing the belief that nothing outside his control truly mattered. And now that belief was colliding with something he could not reduce. Something that existed whether he accepted it or not. She moved slightly then, just enough to draw his full attention, her fingers shifting against the sheet, her breathing catching for a brief second before steadying again, and he leaned forward instinctively, his focus narrowing completely to her as if the rest of the room no longer existed. "Emily," he said quietly, the sound of her name unfamiliar in his own voice, softer than anything he had said to her before, but she did not respond, not yet, her eyes still closed, her expression still distant, and for the first time he felt something that was not calculation, not control, but something closer to uncertainty, to the realization that he could not simply decide what happened next. The nurse glanced at him briefly, then back at the monitor, her tone calm but firm. "She needs time," she said, "both physically and emotionally, and stress is the last thing she should face right now." The word settled between them, not as a warning, but as a boundary, one that did not bend for status or authority, and Sebastian nodded slightly, more out of instinct than agreement, because he was still trying to understand what it meant to respond to something without controlling it. His gaze dropped again, this time noticing something he had missed before, her purse resting on the chair nearby, partially open, the edge of an envelope visible just inside, the same envelope she had held earlier, the one he had dismissed without a second thought, and now it seemed impossible to ignore, impossible to see as anything other than what it likely contained. He hesitated for only a moment before reaching for it, his movement slower than usual, more deliberate, as if he understood that whatever he was about to confirm would not allow him to return to the certainty he had before. His fingers closed around the envelope, and for a brief second he simply held it, feeling the weight of something so light and yet so significant, before opening it carefully, sliding the thin photograph into view. The image was simple, grainy, almost abstract to someone who did not know what they were looking at, but he knew, instantly, without needing explanation, without needing confirmation, and as he stared at it, the room seemed to narrow again, everything else fading into the background as the reality in his hand aligned with the reality in front of him. This was not a possibility anymore, not a question, not something he could dismiss or negotiate. This was real, and it had been real long before he chose to ignore it. His grip tightened slightly, not enough to damage the photograph, but enough to betray the shift happening beneath his controlled exterior, and for the first time, the weight of his earlier words settled fully into place, no longer abstract, no longer distant, but directly connected to something that could not be undone, something that now demanded more from him than he had ever been required to give. The photograph did not leave his hand, even after the initial shock had settled into something quieter but far more dangerous, because it was no longer just an image, it was evidence, it was truth, it was something that stood in direct opposition to everything he had said only minutes ago, and as Sebastian stared at it, The sharp contrast between what he had believed and what now existed in undeniable form began to press against him in a way he could not ignore. He exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting between the grainy outline in the photo and Emily lying just a few feet away, the connection between them no longer abstract, no longer distant, but immediate and unbreakable, whether he was ready for it or not. She had carried this alone. The thought returned again, clearer now, heavier, and with it came another realization, one that settled deeper than the first, because it was not just about what she had endured, it was about what he had done, or more precisely, what he had failed to do. His mind replayed the moment again, his voice, his certainty, the way he had reduced her existence to something insignificant in front of an entire room, and now that same certainty felt hollow, stripped of the authority it once held, replaced by something far less comfortable, something that did not allow him to remain unchanged. The door opened quietly behind him, but he did not turn, not immediately, his focus still fixed on the two realities in front of him, one in his hand, one on the bed, both demanding something from him that he had never been required to give before. "She is waking up," the nurse said gently, her voice low but clear, and the words shifted everything again, pulling him out of the stillness and into something more immediate, more uncertain. He looked up, just in time to see Emily stir, her brows tightening slightly as consciousness returned in slow, uneven waves, her breathing changing, her fingers curling faintly against the sheet as if testing the reality of where she was. For a moment, she did not open her eyes, and in that brief pause, Sebastian felt something unfamiliar rise again, not control, not calculation, but something closer to anticipation, to the realization that whatever happened next would not follow any structure he understood. Then her eyes opened, slowly, adjusting to the light, unfocused at first before gradually finding clarity, and when they did, they landed on him. The recognition was immediate. So was the shift in her expression. It was not shock, not confusion, but something steadier, something that carried the memory of everything that had already happened between them, and it created a distance that felt far more intentional than anything he had imposed earlier. For a second, neither of them spoke. The room held that silence carefully, as if even the smallest sound might disrupt something fragile that had yet to fully form. "You should not be here," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm, not weak, not uncertain, and the strength in it caught him off guard more than anything else had tonight. He took a small step closer, the photograph still in his hand, though he did not raise it, not yet. "We need to talk," he replied, his tone controlled, but lacking the sharp edge it had carried before, and she noticed, he could tell she noticed, but it did not change her expression. "There is nothing to talk about," she said, her gaze steady, her hand shifting slightly toward her abdomen again in that same protective instinct he now understood completely, and the gesture landed harder than any words could have, because it was not just about her anymore, it was about something else, something he had already affected whether he intended to or not. "You do not get to decide that anymore," he said, more quietly than before, and for the first time, there was no authority in the statement, no expectation that it would be accepted simply because he said it, only a recognition that the situation itself had already changed the rules. Her eyes flickered briefly, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in something more complex, something that held both exhaustion and resolve at the same time, and when she spoke again, her voice carried both. "You already decided," she said, and the words landed with a precision that did not need to be raised to be felt, because they were true in a way neither of them could deny. The photograph in his hand felt heavier now, not physically, but in what it represented, in what it demanded, and for the first time, Sebastian realized that whatever he said next would not be about maintaining control, it would be about whether he was willing to face the consequences of everything he had already done, and whether he could become something different than the man who had stood in that ballroom and believed he could define someone else's worth with a single sentence. The silence that followed her words did not break easily, it settled between them with a weight that neither of them could move without changing something fundamental, and for the first time in his life, Sebastian did not reach for control, did not try to override the moment with authority or certainty, because he could feel, even without fully understanding it, that this was not something he could force into submission. He looked at her differently now, not as someone standing on the edge of his world, but as someone who had been carrying something real inside it while he chose not to see it, and that realization shifted the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way he held the photograph that still rested in his hand like a quiet, undeniable truth. "You are right," he said finally, his voice low, steady, but stripped of the sharp edge it once carried, and the words alone were enough to make her expression flicker, just slightly, because this was not the man who had stood in that ballroom and dismissed her with a single sentence. I did decide, he continued, his gaze not leaving hers, and I was wrong. The admission did not come easily, it was not practiced, not polished, and that was exactly why it mattered, because it did not sound like something designed to fix the situation, it sounded like something he was still learning how to say. Emily did not respond immediately, her eyes studying him with a kind of quiet caution, as if she were measuring not just his words, but the space between them. The difference between what he was saying now and what he had shown her before, and for a moment it was clear that words alone would not be enough. You do not get to rewrite this, she said, her voice still calm but carrying a firmness that had not been there before tonight, because whatever had shifted in her had settled into something solid, something that did not bend easily. He nodded once, slowly, accepting the boundary without trying to challenge it, because for the first time he understood that this was not about convincing her, it was about proving something he had never needed to prove before. I am not trying to rewrite it, he said, his tone measured, deliberate, I am trying to face it. The difference hung in the air, subtle but important, and she felt it, even if she did not trust it yet. His gaze dropped briefly to the photograph in his hand, then back to her, and this time when he spoke, there was something deeper in it, something that went beyond explanation. I did not know, he said, but I should have listened, and the weight of that realization was evident in the way he held himself, in the way he did not look away, did not soften the truth to make it easier to accept. Emily's hand shifted again, resting lightly against her abdomen, and this time he did not miss it, did not misunderstand it, and the significance of that single gesture settled into place with a clarity that left no room for distance. This is not about you anymore, she said quietly, and the words carried no accusation, only truth, because the reality between them had already expanded beyond anything either of them could ignore. He nodded again, more firmly this time, because that was something he could not deny, not after what he had seen, not after what he now held in his hand. I know, he replied, and the simplicity of the response was different from anything he had offered before, because it did not attempt to take control of the situation, it acknowledged it. The room remained still around them, the nurse giving them space without leaving completely, the quiet hum of the monitor marking time in steady, unchanging intervals, and in that stillness, something began to take shape, not resolution, not forgiveness, but the beginning of something else, something that required more than words, more than intention. Sebastian took a small step back then, not retreating, but creating space, something he had never considered necessary before, and as he did, he placed the photograph gently on the small table beside her, not holding on to it, not keeping it as something he controlled, but returning it to where it belonged, to her, to the truth she had carried long before he was willing to see it. I am not going anywhere, he said quietly, not as a demand, not as a declaration of control, but as something simpler, something that did not ask for immediate acceptance, only time, and for the first time since she had opened her eyes, Emily did not look away immediately, because even though trust had not returned, even though the distance between them remained, something in his voice no longer sounded like the man who had decided she was nothing, and that difference, however small, was enough to change what came next. The room did not change, but something inside it had, something quiet and steady that settled between them after his words, not as resolution, not as forgiveness, but as the beginning of something that had never existed before, something that neither of them could fully define yet but could both feel taking shape in the silence. Emily's gaze remained on him for a moment longer, searching, not for perfection, not for promises, but for something real, something that could exist beyond the damage already done, and what she saw was not certainty, not control, but something unfamiliar in him, something unguarded, something that did not try to dominate the space between them but instead stood within it, uncertain and present at the same time. She exhaled slowly, her hand still resting lightly against her abdomen, the gesture no longer instinctive alone but intentional now, a quiet reminder of what mattered most, and when she spoke again, her voice carried that same grounded clarity. You do not get to fix this overnight, she said, not harsh, not angry, but firm in a way that left no room for misunderstanding, and he nodded immediately, not resisting, not negotiating, because for the first time he understood that this was not a situation to be solved, it was something to be lived through, step by step, without shortcuts. I know, he replied, and the simplicity of the answer held more weight than anything more elaborate could have, because it acknowledged the time, the patience, the effort he had never had to give before. The nurse adjusted the monitor quietly, glancing at Emily with a small, reassuring nod before stepping back again, and the steady rhythm of the machine filled the space where words were no longer necessary, marking time in a way that felt almost symbolic now, each second a reminder that things did not change instantly, that some things required waiting, healing, and care. Sebastian's eyes moved once more to the photograph resting on the table beside her, then back to her, and for a brief moment, the connection between those 2 points felt clearer than anything else in the room, not as a solution, but as a responsibility, something that did not belong to his world of transactions and outcomes, but to something far more human, far more permanent. He took another small step back, giving her space not because he was unsure, but because he was choosing to respect it, and that choice, simple as it was, marked the first real shift in who he was becoming in that moment. Outside, the faint echo of the gala still lingered somewhere beyond the walls, a distant reminder of the world he had come from, the world where he had spoken those words without hesitation, without consequence, and yet now that world felt further away, less relevant, because what stood in front of him could not be reduced to reputation or control. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, not in exhaustion alone, but in something closer to release, as if for the first time she was allowing herself to believe that she did not have to carry everything alone anymore, not completely, not without the possibility of something changing, even if that change was slow, even if it was uncertain. When she opened them again, her gaze softened just slightly, not fully, not enough to erase the distance, but enough to acknowledge that something had shifted, however small, however